So hello, Ariella. It's great that you are there on the other side to just wrap up this series of letters, this correspondence. I would like to start by describing to the audience, to those listening to this recording, what the correspondences are. This is actually a series of exchange of letters that Foto Colectania, the Foundation Foto Colectania, started some years ago in order to address some of the hottest and burning issues in the field of photography. So the idea was that resorting to a written letter, it would actually bring kind of a slower pace to the reflection and to the debate, and that's why it's so extraordinary that we, after four letters, are concluding by having this conversation on Zoom. So I want to thank you, Foto Colectania, for inviting me, first of all, and also for inviting you, and for having provided this opportunity to address what we have called photography on strike, an idea that I took directly from your last book, Potential History and Learning Imperialism, but at the same turn that you took from Du Bois. So I'd like also to kind of propose a very quick itinerary through the four letters. I'd like to say that I started by trying to push discourses on photography to the limit, so much as to identify discourses on photography with debates on political philosophy. As we were going through this pandemic, we saw how this pandemic also kind of evolved into a different moment after George Floyd's assassination by a police officer and all that happened afterwards. And as I said in my last letter, things snowballed. And from asking what could do photography for nowadays politics, or what is photography to do with the actual body politic, we ended up witnessing lively how, these multitudes were toppling down several monuments that were qualified as part of the white supremacist history, or as you would prefer to say, part of this imperialist history, this imperialist legacy. So to just say it briefly, I think that we've been very much revolving around the idea that photography cannot only be regarded as a bit of paper representing another bit of the world, or as an index of the world. Photography is something that is actually echoing all these transformations in the actual body politic, something you've been rehearsing in two extraordinary books. One, The Civil Contract of Photography from 2008, and the most recent one, Potential History and Learning Imperialism. And I would like to say, by observing extraordinary moments like the Arab Spring, like the moment when around 2010, 2011, in countries like Cairo, the revolution was becoming something real, something enacted again by multitudes. And coming from the field of photography, coming from a country like Israel, where you have devoted so much effort to kind of rid the colonial kind of legacy and vicious relationship between Israelis and Palestinians, it looks like you've been pushing always photography to the limits, to limits somehow unexpected for someone who comes from a more traditional perspective in the history of photography. So I would like to start by kind of asking, I mean, what will photography become after all these series of events, breakthroughs, and why not revolutions? I mean, are we risking to make of photography just a different political modality, or how will photography kind of coexist, or how different discourses on photography will be able to coexist, like the classic historical reference to photography and this other way of understanding photography that you have championed by, looking at photography as an extension of these forms of making politics.
Yeah, so let me start also by thanking. So I thank you, of course, for inviting me to have this correspondence with you and now this conversation, and of course our host, Foto Colectania. And you laid down different questions, and I'm asking myself from where to start. So I'll start maybe from the end, even though I took some notes. Maybe I'll come back to them later about what you said at the beginning about, the genre of writing letters. When you invited me to this correspondence, I was already in the midst of a project of writing letters with no, let's say, someone to respond to them. Writing letters because I felt like this is my only way to resituate myself in the situation. But I would like to address two things that you mentioned now. One of them is the general strike, and the other one about photography. So let's start with photography. And I really like the prudence that, the careful way that you are looking for the words in order to even raise the question about photography. Because I think we are inherited, or we were socialized to a very narrow vocabulary to address photography, a very narrow vocabulary that makes photography into a productive practice, which means that we are spectators of the products, of the photographs. Mm-hmm. And as you mentioned in our correspondence, and you referred generously to my writings, what I'm trying to do is to think about what I call political ontology of photography, which means photography is another way to understand the way that we share the world together. So I just, noted 4 ways that you struggled with how to ask the question. And I think that it's really important to pay attention to it, because this is what it is about. Because the way that we will unlearn the vocabulary of white supremacy, of racial capitalism, is the only way that we will be able to imagine our world together with others outside of all the layers of those, regimes. So you started by how photography is echoing the strike, and you felt that it's not the right word because it's not about echoing, right? It's something else. So you switched to what would photography become? And then you also felt that it's not the right way. And I'm not saying it to say that you did wrong. I point to it because I think that this is really the challenge. And I'm doing it all the time when I'm writing. I'm writing and I'm revising myself, 10 times in 1 hour, because everything that I write is corrupted, and I have to rewrite and to rewrite until I'm able to withdraw, to dissociate myself from everything that we inherited as really racial capitalism, imperialism, and white supremacy. And then you ask how photography coexists with, or is an extension of. And I think that this is really very, very important. And it's not in order to select one of them. It's just to show how important it is that we will relate to photography, to art, to universities, to knowledge, to academia, not as something that is apart and as a kind of privileged position or privileged thing to say about reality, but something that is, to begin with, part of this reality. So now to address your question about photography, and in general, the general strike. And you mentioned Du Bois, which is really a key figure in my attempt to think the general strike. And I think that it's not only his notion of the general strike, but the way that he articulates it inspires, not only me, inspires many. And just to mention one of the brilliant books that articulate the general strike is Saidia Altman, The Wayward Lives, where she is going back to the beginning of the 20th century and speaks about, identified the general strike. So there is something about the general strike that is not a call, let's go to a protest. It's something that happens. So it's something that you have to be very attentive and to understand if this is the moment of the general strike. And it's not about, individual who identified. It's something about, the way that people share the world together that is not always synchronized, even though earlier on they synchronize many of their actions that generate a certain situation. And what happened now, in this kind of crossing between the pandemic on the one hand, that created, kind of work stoppage in a certain way. Not everybody, of course, there are many people who still work and put their life in danger, and even forced by the regime to put their life in danger while others are being protected. But in general, the machine doesn't work in the same way, which means that our actions do not nurture in the same way the machine. There is a moment, a potentiality of a general strike. So this is one thing that I wanted to say about the general strike. So we have on the one hand the pandemic, on the other hand, we have, the exposure in a globalized moment of arrest, of stoppage of labor, the exposure on a globalized scale of the way that police brutality, police and army, and I would like to involve also the army, because in the case of Israel-Palestine, it's mainly the army that renders Palestinian lives do not matter. So police and the military, all of a sudden, even though, so many texts were written about it, so many enterprises in order to abolish police and military, but all of a sudden, it became clear to many, together with this moment of stoppage of work. So this is a very particular radical moment in which we are. Now coming back to photography, when we speak about strikes, and there are, endless strikes along history, and photography, I have collections of photographs of strike, but this is not the question. The question is not, again, to use photography to document the strike in an extraordinary way or in an unprecedented way. The question is, what does it mean that photography is on strike? What does it mean that photography doesn't cross the picket line? So here, it's, a different way to pay attention to something that under racial capitalism, we tend always to forget. We value so much not only productivity, but also actions, as if actions will lead or will yield the change that we want to see, the transformation. But I think that when we think about inactions, when we think about the power to seize from action, what the pandemic actually endowed us with, on a very large scale. Many people are now, in a kind of total or partial withdrawal from their ordinary positions. So they are not required on a daily basis, each and every moment of their day, to produce for the capital. So here comes the question of photography. How all the inactions that were involved in the history of photography, how they can be materialized into part of the general strike.
Ariella, since we are having this conversation sort of in the frame of a small institution, a center for photography like Fundación Foto Colectania, I would like to still insist on thinking from the very perspective of photography. So how would you imagine teaching photography right at this moment? Let's imagine yourself in a position like you are indeed, because you are a professor at the university, at Brown University. what it would be like to teach photography at this moment?
You know, I found myself, designing a new course for the fall, and this course is titled "Photography on the Picket Line." Unlearning imperial formations of photography. So teaching photography would be exactly that, to ask what does it mean when photography is on the picket lines. So, there are many answers to this. And I think that, for me, for example, when I think about yesterday, the mother of Tamir Rice, who was also assassinated by the police a few years ago, when she spoke about the fact that the exhibition at Cleveland Museum should not take place because of an artist using the images of the last moments of the life of her son, we have to take this not as a moment of exception. We have to ask ourselves, what does it mean about photography? And this is part of teaching photography, is teaching a moment of refusal, is teaching a moment of telling people to perform in action rather than an action, rather than thinking that we have to account for the reality by reusing these images. Even if we alter them, what does it mean to stop using them? What does it mean to let Tamir Rice's mother to guide the way that photographers think about their profession? What does it mean to seize, to be on the picket line in relation to photography? First of all, means to be on the picket line of expertise, to be on the picket line of the profession. So when you have these kind of calls coming from outside of the profession, the question is, how do we understand them as part of the formation of the picket line? So another example that I can bring, which is, about hundreds of photographs. There is a book that was published in France, I think that it's already 2 years ago, by a historian that, collected or stumbled upon a collection of postcards in which you see sexual violence against women in the colonies. And it's a kind of coffee table book, very expensive, that, is made by a white historian, is addressing, white audience mainly, or at least wealthy audience. The bourgeoisie that would critique its empire without any accountability. And a group of activists and scholars in France called Cas Rebelle, Rebellion Cabins, I would translate it into English. They wrote an extraordinary manifesto calling to withdraw this book of photographs, of postcards from circulation. Unfortunately, their call was not responded by the publishing house, neither by the historian. But I think that, if we take their call, their manifesto to be the picket line, we should not cross this picket line. So here is another example. And another example on which, I'm writing in the book is where I'm imagining, and then I'm saying, but actually it happened several times. Let's mobilize it as a power, as a force, when photographers question their ownership of photographs that was actually taken and extracted most of the time from people. And even if the moment of taking the photograph was more generous than, in previous decades, we have to understand photographs in relation to the primitive accumulation of photographic wealth throughout, we can already say centuries, right? 19th century, 20th century, and we are in the 21st century. So this primitive accumulation of photographic wealth defined each and every act of holding a camera in front of others. So there is so much to do as participant in this, in the shared world through photography, that I think that teaching is not made superfluous or unnecessary. On the contrary, maybe should not be called only teaching, but maybe getting together and starting to ask questions about the inactions rather than about the actions.
Yeah, this actually brings me to recall for those listening that you have succeeded in actually filling up, if I can say, filling up the gap left by this possibility of not doing photographs or not using photographs that you renounce to be complicit to. And one can mention, for example, the unshovable photographs of 1948 that you came across at the International Red Cross Archive in Geneva, or the untaken photographs from 1945 in Berlin right after the end of World War II. Those untaken photographs that do not reveal the massive rape taking place among the rebels in the city of Berlin. So all these genres, untaken photographs, unshovable photographs, and corrected photographs, like one can find in the extraordinary work you presented with the series Errata, that it was presented at the Tapis Foundation, actually, this exhibition that we co-curated together just a few months ago. So all these different genres require that you perform not only as an academic, but also as someone who operates from common sense. This is something we have already been talking about. But I really like the idea that photography can really continue by other means.
So, you know, Carlos, I would like to turn the question to you. I'll come back to those, you know, unshowable photograph, untaken photograph, errata, etc. But before that, I would like to continue to dwell another moment on the general strike and to turn the question to you. You curated several years ago, now I cannot recall the date, together with Tom Keenan, a very important exhibition called Anti-Photojournalism. So,
Mhm.
you know, the work that we are doing, I tend always to think about it, you know, as something that always has precedence. Because, you know, we cannot speak about, you know, a general strike that is so justified against the racial capital and think that we invent anything, right? So the
Mm.
question is always how you create the depthness or the breadth of all, you know, the other people who were engaged in similar activities, even if they didn't relate to it with this terminology, right? You
Exactly.
didn't do the anti-photojournalism with the terminology of the picket line or of
Mm.
Imagine going on strike. But on the other hand, when I'm thinking about this exhibition, I think how much, you know, we can understand the people that you involved in this exhibition as people who actually went on strike against the
Mhm.
way news or the press frame what is photography. So, you know, as I said earlier, this is a lesson that I got from Du Bois. Uh, uh, the general strike, if there is a general strike, it's not at the moment when it happens that you say, I'm going to the street in order to participate in a general strike. It's something that all of a sudden gets its meaning from the
Mm.
so many that participate in it. And and I'm thinking about, you know, this moment of anti-photojournalism as a moment of going on strike that you try to put together in one space in order to create resonance between different participants. So I would like to ask you if you can, you know, now rewind in your mind this exhibition and think about it, how it can help us to go further with this idea of the general strike, how you can re-articulate today some of what you included there, some of what you tried to put together in, in this perspective.
Yeah, to begin with, actually, this is 10 years ago, and you are right. I mean, even myself, I could not articulate the idea of anti-photojournalism by myself. It was thanks to visiting year after year a city like Perpignan, where by the month of September, all the professionals gather to show their work, all with the same exact format, the same exact rituals to approach many different events across the world. So it was by acting almost like an ethnographer and looking at those professionals, their bodily attitudes, the way they were, I would say, they were capturing the events all in the same formats and language and sizes and types of pictures. And you know, that I became, it all became suspicious. It looks like photojournalism. It was becoming a truly universal language, a truly universal code in order to cope with different events, no matter what the causes were, where were they taking place. So it had a very kind of respectful attitude towards the professionals, because you know, these are the professionals that are able, or that are ready to exchange their life for an image, which doesn't really happen in any other kind of image production. You know, we see at the end of the year the list of all those photojournalists who lost their lives as they were working on the spot on different conflicts. So all these ingredients made me feel extremely cautious if I ever wanted to address a critique to this behavior, which is mostly behavior rather than a particular image. And also the idea that photojournalism, it is a genre in itself that has not much evolved throughout the 20th century. If we look at the work of Robert Capa and the most recent examples of photojournalism, you know, the basic assumptions are all the same, still there, no matter whether ones were black and white and the most recent ones might be in color. So basically, altogether, it looks like photojournalism was configured as a sort of teleological thinking. So we need it because we need those images to be informed about whatever is going on the other side of the world. And because we cannot access, we delegate on these professionals. But at the same time, I mean, this regime becomes almost like a church. You cannot criticize it. Critique is out of question. Eh?
Mm-hmm.
And then, so how do you organize a critique of such an institution like photojournalism? Then we realized with Tom Kinnan that there were certain symptoms and little gestures here and there that could help us, you know, to kind of bracket and throw some sort of critical light on the practice of photojournalism. And I remember that the most powerful critiques would not just come from artists who were allegedly working outside of the photojournalistic regime, but from some of the very photojournalists who are on the field and experience the contradictions of this kind of way of functioning. And I can't remember particular names, but the most powerful critique came from those ones who actually felt somehow betrayed in their professional way of functioning. There were photographers who actually made photographs of one particular event, photographs that were published and captioned, and then for some reason, 1 year or two later, they would realize that what they thought they understood with that photograph was not exactly what it happened. And they also kind of realized that they could not change this caption, that photojournalism constructs a sense of history, causality, and of the event in which whatever happens gets engraved in history forever. So this kind of imposing of the moment, of the decisive, crucial moment, it articulates the whole practice. So photojournalism became, as you were suggesting, a sort of symptom to make all these practices at least suspect to some sort of obedience to a larger institution, a larger structure in which photography could not even be questioned or interrogated. So the only way to interrogate this practice was by mixing professionals and non-professionals. So that was the moment when the crowd crowdsource photography, crowdsource journalism throw some sort of doubts on the very practice of the professionals. So basically, photojournalism, anti-photojournalism was addressed to stop for a second and reflect on a practice that would go mostly unreflected. So in a way, I mean, it was also suggesting that it should go on strike. Then you had these moments in some newspapers when out of the blue, one day, in order to commemorate the deaths of the professionals, they say, today we're not going to have any images on our newspaper to make visible how important these images are and the work of these professionals, how important it is. But then even this gesture makes nothing to the power of a structure like photojournalism based, as I said, on a belief, because the idea is that those images are included in the newspaper as something to be believed, but not as something that we can empirically test or say, okay, if I look at the newspaper today and there is a photograph from wherever, Iran, I cannot just go and test its veracity or its realism. This image is there in the newspaper just to be believed. So this is what led me to believe that photojournalism is constructed as a theological regime. I mean, in the Western cultures, we tend to criticize, the Arab world because it's a theocratic regime, etc. But at the very core of public opinion in Western cultures, photojournalism also performs as a theological regime. So all these kind of little suspicions were what motivated anti-photojournalism. Yeah.
Yeah, so let me continue in this direction and just, respond to some of the things that you said and take us with this anti-photojournalism to Palestine. So, first of all, thank you for the way that you described the emergence of anti-photojournalism. I think it's really important. And as I told you several times, it should be in the writing, it should be published. As you asked me, how can teach? I would be really grateful to have the catalog of anti-photojournalism for my class, Photography of the Picket Line. So now it is recorded, so at least we have, the beginning of the introduction. So, I listened to what you said, and, it makes me think, of course, immediately about one of the, major category that I propose in the book that we have to unlearn, which is the new. And I think the church that you described, the church of photojournalism, is predicated on the new. Every day you have to have a new photograph. And it's not that the new is really assessed for what is in there. It's just as to be the new, the field, this slot of the new. And I think that what you described, we wanted to stop for a second. The idea of the general strike is when this, attempt to stop for a second is all of a sudden in relation with other moments or other enterprises of inactions in other places. And as you explained, very quickly, photojournalism, even if there was a moment of slowing down, the church continue to affirm its beliefs. So I would like to think about this, in relation to Palestine. And I would like to think about it in relation to Palestine because, Palestinians are on a general strike for many, many years now. And when you think about the Great March of Return, that started 3-4 years ago, this, gave it a name. But the Great March of Return, they're not walking, right? They're in place. So the Great March of Return is the Great March of, staying in the same place and saying, this should be transformed. The regime should be abolished, right? So I think that when we are speaking about photography in the context of Palestine, it's of course not about discrete photographs that gives us an aperture to see the suffering of Palestinians. The question is, how do you rethink photography in a radical way in order to account for the act of photography, or for the photography as something that partake not only in changing itself as a practice to produce other, accounts of reality, but how you account for photography as partaking in a meaningful, substantial general strike that called for the abolition of the regime. And what we have in the Great March of Return, of course, sometimes, we can encounter on social media images from the Great March of Return. For the mainstream media, it even doesn't exist. So we encounter images, but the question is not about encountering images. The question is how, many people in the Great March of Return are also holding the camera and participating in the call or in the performance of the call for the abolition of the regime, or the abolition of the monument that is called the State of Israel. And how the State of Israel, it's not that, photographers are willing to exchange their life for a photograph, as you described, in this kind of long 20th century ethos of photographers from Kappa to others. It's the State of Israel that targets deliberately photographers, because the photographers there are not provided of news. They are part of the community that is on strike. So they withdrew from this, privileged position of accounting for the reality from the outside, and they partake in the general strike, which is for 72 years, Palestinians calling to stop the regime that decided that they are not part of Palestine. And in this sense, when I'm thinking about, Palestinians, photographers from time to time, when they are amplifying the fact that they are part of this strike by going on strike, putting black tapes on their faces or not activating their cameras, these are the more legible, images or imagery or imagination that we can grasp from something that is much broader. And just one more thing about, Palestine in this context, in the context of, the pandemic, in the context of the potentiality to understand this moment as a general strike. We have to understand that what we see with the Black Lives Matter becoming today, what I call, in my letter to you that will be published on Friday, Black Lives Matter grammar, that became all of a sudden a grammar that is the proper grammar. Black Lives Matter exists for several years, but the Black movement to say that Black Lives Matter exists, from the beginning of the kidnapping of people from Africa. It didn't start yesterday. But all of a sudden, many institutions realized that they cannot, continue with at least their legible, layer of state racism or state-sponsored racism. And what we see in the street, what we see, the millions around the world that are going to the street, they are following Black Lives Matter grammar. But when it comes to Palestine, we are in the regime of exceptions. Palestine is an exception. A few days after the assassination of George Floyd, Ayad al-Hayyak was assassinated by Israeli forces in Jerusalem. And as I was writing my response to you, there was another assassination that took place. And not only that Erakat was assassinated, the State of Israel refuses to give the body back to the family. So we are not even speaking about saying their names. Like here, it became obvious that, there should be this, space where this is being at the center of the conversation. It is imposed on institutions to stop, their blah, blah, and to acknowledge that the state is a racist state that has a police in order to reproduce white supremacy. In Israel, I was able to find, very little about opposing the assassination of Erakat, and previously all the other assassinations for decades. But if it's only under this imperial temporality that you would say that very little in Israel-Palestine was, performed in the streets as a protest against this assassination, as an attempt to say their names. If we withdraw from this imperial temporality, we actually have to look at 72 years of a general strike performed by Palestinians against the existence of a state that is built in order to make their existence vulnerable, in order to make their lives lives that do not matter.
Ariella, at this point of the conversation that you are sort of bringing together or into a parallel Black Lives Matter in the US and Palestinian Lives Matter as well on a different corner of the planet, and that you speak of interrupting the imperialist sense of history and temporality, I think it's the right moment to introduce a key term in your work, which is potential history, a term or a sort of almost like a toolkit in itself that allows for collaborations out of history and beyond borders. And we see that nowadays, actually, the battle, it's very much on that kind of ground. When we've been reading what's been happening to a scholar, an academic like Achille Mbembe, that he's being accused for bringing together, South African apartheid and kind of labeling the Israeli state as a state that also, generates an apartheid towards Palestinians. Someone in Germany reacted very fiercely to say that that was not comparable. So my question is, potential history, it seems to me as a very powerful kind of way of opening up the possibilities to bring remote situations together and generate new forms of solidarity that were not possible before. Considering the potential history, it is actually the possibility to rewrite long centuries of history that sort of legitimate the war, legitimate like the enmity. And I found myself using the terms or these kind of idea when retracing the history of the Basque Country in Spain from after Spanish Civil War up until very much our days, and considering that the idea of terrorism or the very existence of terrorism kind of foreclosed the possibility to speak of a peace. And then by resorting to potential history, one can all of a sudden take what were considered factual events and reorganize them in order to make possible to speak about peace, as you have done, for example, in the case of Palestine and its terrible history since 1948. So can you evaluate what will be the use or the potential of the idea of potential history nowadays?
Yeah, so maybe evaluate is not the right word. I don't think that I'll be able to evaluate, but let me try to respond to your question from 2-3 different perspectives. So first of all, yeah, potential history is key in the question that you are asking, because and let's tie it together with photography. The state of Israel was created through a campaign of violence in 47, 48, 49, 50, until it became a fait accompli. A fait accompli, which means, the international opinion, in the international organizations, everybody recognized the state of Israel as a legitimate actor. When we think about photographers, those that are associated with the humanist photography, those that are associated, with the concerned photography and later on engaged photography, when you look at what they did at the time, it's revolting. It is really revolting. They are taking photographs of Israel as if it was always there. So what happens here are two things. The state of Israel, once it was able to use a lot of violence to expel the majority of the Palestinians from the body politic and to declare we exist as a sovereign state, everybody was compelled to relate to it as a fait accompli. Photography was, invented, in my eyes, of course, not in the beginning of the 19th century, but with imperialism, but its ideology was invented when the device was invented, as if this device is made to take photographs to document reality. So all those humanist photographers went to Israel and documented reality. Israel was already there. 2 days ago, it didn't exist. 2 days ago, Palestinians still said, it's the biggest robbery of the 20th century. Stop it. They take all our lands. They take everything. No, 2 days after, when the state existed, it inserted itself into their minds in a way that they use their cameras to document the existence of the state. So here we see, really the collusion, the complicity between white supremacy, because Israel is a Jewish white supremacist state, and photography. And we see how photography plays to these ideologies of the fait accompli, and then all the other actors are not even counted, or are being photographed as, the victims forever. Palestinians as if they were born refugees, as if they didn't have, a thriving life in Israel prior to that. So for me, the term peace is a no term that I would use, because it's not only to legitimize those who are made illegitimate because they used violence, like you mentioned in the case of the bus, to legitimize Palestinians as legitimate interlocutors. No, it's to undo the terms under which we imagine that there will be a peace between Israelis and Palestinians, which means that Israelis is already a fait accompli. And for me, it is really important, together with Palestinians, to keep Israel in question. And rather than imagining peace between these two entities, is first of all to withdraw from this violence, to abolish the violent mechanisms, and to let all Palestinians exercise their right to return to their land. So you don't speak about peace, you speak about their being part of the body politic that would decide what will be the regime out there. And then comes, the question, or not then, but alongside this, there is the question of how to bring remote situations, as you said, together around solidarity. But it's also, or first of all, to undo the terms of not the remote situations, but to undo the terms of the violence that constituted the situation in a way that we would even speak about peace between Jews and Palestinians, rather than about, first of all, reparations, return, and making them who they were before everything was taken from them, meaning those who define what would be the shared life together with Jews.
That's great. I mean, I did really want not to miss at least this bit on potential history, because I think that here lies one of your most radical contributions to all you have written. For those who might be watching this recording, I mean, I would like to recall this extraordinary work you did, Act of a State, covering images taken by photojournalists between 1947, 1967. Exactly.
From Palestine to Israel, 48.
By
something, yeah.
Exactly.
States is in 67, 2007.
Which is also a series of work, a series of images that we showed in the context of anti-photojournalism. And I would like to recall that it was exhibited next to the work of forensic architecture, just to kind of frame a little bit your efforts also in a larger landscape of efforts to kind of break away from the idea of photography as pure evidence, and revealing that photography, it's a powerful tool for new political philosophy. And as you may imagine, I'm already wrapping up because we are running out of time. We still have 5 minutes. But then, I mean, what else do you think is missing from this conversation and the exchange we had so far? Because, you know, I mean, the dynamics of letters, it's like one says something and the other one feels compelled to respond. But what is it that you feel that it's missing from this conversation at this point?
Wow. No, I'm not sure that I can, jump in with a reply to this question.
Hmm.
I think that, radical moments are moments of opportunity. I can just,
Right.
wish with so many other people around me that it will lead to the abolition of all those structures that are in place since the very beginning of imperialism and racial capitalism, to begin with the police, the army, in the case of Israel, and the power of the capital to continue to play with lives of people.
Right. Well, I would say that, I mean, it is kind of a great sort of advantage to realize that photography, that was always considered a sort of a minor practice, can be so central for all the changes to come, and that photography has an extraordinary force when it is once it is understood and regarded as this broader political action as you can actually do, with all your work. And we have to leave it here, but I would like to say again, thank you very much to you. It's been a great opportunity to think aloud as the events were unfolding. And also thank you to finish with Foto Colectania, Georgina Armadans, who is here and has been supporting and taking care of all these editing and timing. So thank you very much, Ariella.
Thank you. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.